In this final lesson on not only manslaughter, gross negligence manslaughter, and homicide offences generally, we're going to just talk a little bit more and illustrate with a couple more cases the determination of gross negligence for these cases. So we've made it clear over the last few lessons that the determination of gross negligence goes slightly further than that of an ordinary negligence claim that you may find in, for example, the law of tort. And so, really, we're going to talk a little bit more about how gross negligence is determined in these particular cases. And the first thing that we have to always reference when we think about how gross negligence is determined, the standard of threshold that is required, is that of the role that is played by the jury in these cases. Because while it is the case that there has to be the establishment that the negligence in question was the cause of death for the victim, it is up to the jury to determine whether or not this negligence, which did cause the death of the victim, rose to the level of gross negligence, rose to the level of being passable, for example, for essentially criminal liability. And so it was determined in the case of Adamako that once a duty of care is established, the ordinary ways in which we establish duty of care in relation to the acts or omissions of the defendant, it is up to the jury to consider whether or not there is a breach of duty. The jury will then determine whether or not that breach in question should be characterized as gross negligence. So the jury has quite a significant role in both of these different instances. Not only do they have the role of determining whether or not there was a breach, but then also determining whether or not this breach was so severe and so sufficient that it represented gross negligence and therefore enters into the realm of being of criminal liability. Now, in recent years and in recent cases, there have been issues in limiting the extent to which the jury can go beyond this duty. And given the fact that the jury have so much authority in making determinations as to gross negligence in these different cases, they have a determination on the basis of where breach exists, and they have a determination on the basis of what characterizes gross negligence. There is this question of how far the jury can go and the extent to which the court should be able to limit the power and the extent to which the jury can go beyond the duty that they have established. Now, a case that is quite illustrative of this point comes from 2016, which is the Crown versus Sellu case in the Court of Appeal. In this case, an individual had entered into a hospital to undergo knee replacement surgery. So this was a medical malpractice case, essentially. Further surgery was required as the result of a post-operative bowel complication. And the defendant was the doctor who the victim was referred to, who made the decision to operate at a later date. So he went into the hospital. He had knee surgery, a relatively foregone conclusion as to how the knee surgery was going to operate, but then, no pun intended, but then the further surgery was required because of a post-operative complication that began to take place. Now, the doctor, who was the person who the victim was referred to, made the decision to operate at a later date. And the problem here is that post this operation, the victim never regained consciousness and then ultimately died. Now, the question and the issue here was relating to the delay in the operation, the decision on the part of the doctor, who the victim was referred to decide to operate at a later time. Now, it was held by the courts here that the trial judge needs to give the jury sufficient direction in determining what gross negligence means. So, even though the jury have quite a significant amount of discretion in terms of determining a breach and then determining whether or not the breach of the duty of care, the negligence in question, rises to the level of gross negligence, that standard is something that, even though it is determined by the jury, it is something that needs to be directed by the judge. Making a determination caused the jury to be directed to look for a breach that is truly exceptionally bad, in quotation marks. The act or omission had to be, quote, such a departure from the standard that is consequently amounted to being criminal. Remember, when we talk about gross negligence manslaughter, the word gross in this particular phraseology is very important. We're not just talking about ordinary negligence which arises out of ordinary tort cases. This isn't a case of an individual who finds a decomposing snail in a bottle of beer. This is a case where we have individuals who die, and we have individuals who die as the result of significant departure from the ordinary duty of care, a significant breach of the ordinary duty of care that should be expected of individuals in these different positions. Such a significant breach that it amounts to criminal liability more than just ultimately negligent liability. Now, risk of death was something that was made clear when we talk about the case of Adamako, that the test ought to be whether or not there was a risk of death in making a determination as to whether or not you can make conclusions about gross negligence manslaughter. They say, and I quote, "The jury will have to consider whether the extent to which the defendant's conduct departed from the proper standard of care incumbent upon him involving, as it must have done, a risk of death." The risk of death element is quite important here, because ultimately manslaughter is a homicide offence. One of the things that is very important for a manslaughter charge to even stick is the fact that the victim has to die. It has to be a death of a victim situation. Finally then, let's talk about the case of Crown versus Rose from 2017. This is another case that goes all the way up to the Court of Appeal, and the defendant in this case was an optometrist who had performed a routine eye examination. Now, one of the things you should be amply familiar with already and should have in the back of your mind already is the fact that a lot of gross negligence manslaughter cases arise out of medical negligence cases. So in fact, one of the things that's going to be quite interesting is when we carry on doing our lessons on medical law in the future, we will be talking about gross negligence in that context, and probably will be referencing and citing these cases in more detail as well. But ultimately, the defendant in this case was an optometrist who had performed an eye examination, somebody who works at an optician's. Okay. The result of this eye examination was that the patient, the victim, did not need glasses. Okay, so it was a relatively successful routine eye examination, and they found that there was no need for the victim to have need glasses. Just under half a year later, the victim would die as the result of hydrocephalus. Okay, now this is something that is quite interesting, given the fact that the presence of hydrocephalus should have been seen by any competent optometrist. So one of the things that most people don't really recognize when you talk about going to the opticians is that you don't just go to the opticians for just the health of your eyes, and to determine whether or not you have glasses. A lot of people think that that is the case, but it's a bit more than that, because an optometrist, somebody who examines eyes, are actually able to see a further and a lot more than just the eye itself. They are able to see and potentially diagnose tumours and other kind of very, very serious and significant issues that an examination of the eye can essentially indicate. And the presence of hydrocephalus is one such example here. And any competent optometrist should have been able to see and identify the hydrocephalus, or identify signs of hydrocephalus, such that they would be able to maybe further refer them to a specialist in a hospital, and then for a full diagnosis to have taken place. Instead, the victim was told that they do not need glasses, that there was nothing wrong, and they would have ultimately died just under 6 months later from the hydrocephalus. In addition to this, they have a statutory duty. Optometrists will have a statutory duty to perform an examination for these kinds of conditions in the course of an eye test. So, like I said again, an eye test does not just involve the examination of the eye, it also involves statutorily the examination of other parts of the, or at least in the eye, evidence of anything that could be potentially very serious that would affect the eye in some way. So things like tumours behind the eye can actually be seen by optometrists. Don't tell me how, I'm not a doctor. The defendant had actually performed the correct procedures in this particular in this particular case. The optometrist performed all the statutory duties that they had to do for the examination of the eye test, but they had accidentally viewed previously established images instead. So rather than looking at the images of the patient who was actually in the room at the time, they looked on the images and they saw the images of a previous patient, of a previously viewed established images, or maybe even the same patient but previously to this particular examination. So ultimately, even though they followed all the statutory duties, they were negligent in their actions in essentially being able to identify any kind of very serious problem. Now, while the defendant was convicted at first instance, they were convicted at trial, this conviction was quashed at the Court of Appeal, since there was no serious and obvious risk of death when the duty was breached. And this is quite interesting here, because when the duty was breached, okay, this was during the eye examination, and there would have been no indication that the individual was going to have a serious and obvious risk of death at this particular point. In fact, it was only 6 months later, when the hydrocephalus would develop into a more serious condition, that the victim would die. And so what is interesting here is that the quashing by the Court of Appeal was under the basis that there was this lack of serious risk of death, a standard which was established, or at least referenced, in the original leading case of Adamako.